Just a quick note for this episode. There is bonus content available. We kept talking with Chris after we wrapped the interview, so if you'd like to hear a few more minutes of our conversation with him, including a discussion of G.K. Chesterton, then you might want to consider becoming a member on Patreon or Substack. Support for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere comes from MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And listeners like you who support us on Patreon or Substack, sign up for exclusive benefits at patreon.com/ihearofsherlock or ihearofsherlock.substack.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 286, The Autistic Sleuth.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became astronomer.
In a world where it's always 1895, it's I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we interview authors, editors, creators, and other prominent Sherlockians on various aspects of the great detective in popular culture.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Bert Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Hello and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, I don't even know how to begin this one.
Yes.
Are you neurodiverse?
Am I neurodiverse?
Are you neurodiverse? Yeah.
Am I neurodiverse? I'm neurodiverted. I'm easy.
Neurodivergent?
Neurodiverted. I'm easy to just get off on another topic.
Oh, okay.
And by the way,
what about the
wolf? And by the way, what about the development of constitutional law in Turkey in the 15th century?
Please. Well, today's discussion does contain some talk of neurodiversity. I thought it was an interesting topic for us to pursue because it seems to be more talked about in the world today. I'm seeing more mentions of it in the business world. As a matter of fact, I have a friend who consults with companies on neurodiversity issues. And I think it's primarily understood through the spectrum of autism. And so today we're going to have a discussion with, what's interesting, a longtime listener and author, Christopher Chan, and his mother, Patricia Meyer Chan, who's a clinical psychologist, to talk about autism and detection, particularly television adaptations of various detectives. So it should be an interesting chat. Just a reminder, if you would like to support the show in the fashion that makes sense for you, we are available on Patreon and on Substack. It's just I Hear of Sherlock in both of those places. So patreon.com/ihearofsherlock or ihearofsherlock.substack.com. Both of those give you access to content as paying members. There's also free content available on both platforms as well, so work with whichever one makes sense for you. With Patreon, we have various levels of thank you gifts for support. And over on Substack, you can become a founding member and name your own price, as well as the given $5 a month support there as well. So whatever works for you. We want to be flexible and want to work within your budget. So whatever you can do to help us out to pay for the show, the hosting costs, email, etc., all of that goes into our production budget, and your support makes a world of difference. Okay, beginning with The Sherlockian news. All the news that we choose to cram into this episode. Bert, we have about 6 stories we want to cover. Where would you like to start?
Oh, let's start with 45 years of the Mysterious Bookshop. And we've got a great link to a little CBS News coverage of that. But our friend Otto Penzler at the Mysterious Bookshop in New York celebrated 45 years. And Otto is just a remarkable, he's created quite an enterprise. Otto has created a community of book lovers around mystery and detective fiction. He is a valued resource and friend to the book collector. He himself has been an extraordinary collector of first editions. He's a publisher. He's bringing new texts to market. He's also a brilliant marketer. If you want to collect signed first editions of your favorite mystery writers that are coming out today, look no further than the Mysterious Bookshop. He's created a great community. He's got a great retail shop. And every year for the Baker Street Irregulars weekend, many of us pay a pilgrimage down to the Mysterious Bookshop. We're the ones wearing the funny hats and the Inverness capes, but it's wonderful to have Otto in the position that he's here and that he's celebrated 45 years.
Yeah, just remarkable, and it is the longest operating independent mystery bookshop in the world. Quite a record to have. So we celebrate Otto in that. Also celebrating is the Sherlock Holmes magazine. We just marked 40 years of the Granada Sherlock Holmes series starring Jeremy Brett. Of course, a couple of episodes ago, we had the hosts of the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes podcast on. They will be later this month. They will be celebrating the 40th anniversary with BrettCon. But as it stands, over on the Sherlock Holmes magazine site, issue 16 is out. That is in celebration of the 40th anniversary. And they also have a Kickstarter available to get a reprint going for issue number 2 of the Sherlock Holmes magazine, which had Jeremy Brett on the cover. So
wonderful.
There's an opportunity to get that back issue. If you missed it the first time around, that Kickstarter has issue number 2 available once again.
Yes, and it's important to mention that Adrian Brady, whom we've interviewed on our podcast, is doing a real service to the Sherlockian community with this. Nobody makes money. Look at your watch, friends. It's 2024, and we're talking about a magazine.
Yeah.
Nobody is getting rich producing a print magazine, particularly of the quality of the Sherlock Holmes magazine, the terrific images, the great reproduction, the writers who contribute to the publication. It's really worth supporting because it's a service to the Sherlockian community everywhere.
Well, what else do we have?
Well, we have got a more interesting conversation at the Rosenbach Museum in beautiful Philadelphia. Sherlock Mondays, a very successful program of regular interviews and discussions about the cases of Sherlock Holmes, is now back with Sherlock Mondays, The Hound of the Baskervilles by our friend Ed Pettit, whom we've also talked to on the podcast. And this is a special subscription program that's going to give you the opportunity to participate in great discussions about The Hound of the Baskervilles. And when does it begin? Has it begun already?
No, it begins on May 6th.
Right.
There's a series of hosts, each taking 2 chapters along the way. May 6th begins with Mark Jones and Paul Chapman from the Doings of Doyle podcast. We've spoken with Mark. May 13th, Anastasia Klimchinskaya is back for chapters 3 and 4, and then Monica Schmidt also making a return. Our pal Steve Doyle from Wessex Press and the Fortnightly Dispatch is on May 27th. Curtis Armstrong back on June 3rd. Yours truly on June 10th. Oh, gosh, they gave me 3 chapters. Now I really have to read. And Mary Alcaro coming in on June 17th to wrap up the book. And then finally on June 24th, Max McGee is going to talk about the legacy of the Hound. So really quite a lineup. And this is for subscription only for Sherlock Mondays. Now, the Rosenbach has a special rate for Rosenbach members, but you can also buy a ticket as a general subscriber as well. And once you do, that content will be available for 30 days after it airs. So even if you can't make it live, you can still watch the rebroadcast for up to 30 days.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Curtis Armstrong, our friend.
Yes.
Also, at the BSI dinner in January of this year, Curtis gave a great talk about the B list. And it's just hilarious and thoughtful and beautifully delivered about the lesser villains in the Sherlock Holmes canon. And he weaves in a good deal of his own perspective and experience in, in the fantasy world of the dramatic arts. And this is now available for you to watch on the website of the Red Circle, where Curtis repeated that presentation in March. So it's a lot of fun and good to look at the Red Circle website.
Yeah, the Red Circle has another guest coming up soon, don't they?
Oh, yes. I am going to be lucky enough in June 22nd, to be at the Red Circle meeting in Maryland as the speaker on Arthur Conan Doyle, his life, his memories. And it's one of my favorite subjects, and very much looking forward to that.
Excellent. Wow, for folks in the greater D.C. area, that would be a wonderful opportunity to get to see Bert live and in person.
Yes.
And our pal Olivia Ritigliano has a wonderful write-up on Crime Reads, a comprehensive write-up, as all things with Olivia are. She follows up her piece about 3 years ago where she ranked 100 Sherlock Holmes performances. And now she has 81 best, worst, and strangest Dr. Watson portrayals of all time ranked. So if you'd like to see who falls where in that lineup and who they all are, check that out at Crime Reads.
And finally, we have had the opportunity to join Rippercast's podcast From Adler to Amberley, where we talked about the adventure of the three students and had a lot of fun.
We did have a lot of fun, and that was nice because we didn't have to worry about hosting.
Yes.
So, I've just realized as we've gone through all 6 of these news stories, every single one of the subjects have been guests here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Oh, son of a gun.
That's remarkable.
We must be talking about Sherlock everywhere.
Yeah, to many, many people. Well, I think that's it for the news, but just one other bit of information as long as you're still with us. We will have some bonus content from this episode, so make sure you go to Patreon or Substack and sign up there so you can listen to additional conversation with our guest today. If you haven't been to the MX Publishing site in a while, well, you need to get over there and check out the new material. They are always cranking out new books, and May, April, and into June have lots to choose from. For example, this month we have Sherlock Holmes Eliminate the Impossible, in which Paula Hammond collects 6 pseudo-canonical tales, where we find Holmes and Watson encountering mummies, angels, phantoms, invisible assassins, and, well, maybe it's not exactly what it might appear. And then, in May, Mrs. Hudson for the Defense finds Sherlock Holmes coming back to London from the Sussex Downs to help out Inspector Lestrade and his ally, former landlady Mrs. Hudson. Dr. Watson, it seems, has been accused of murder. Throw in Thomas Wiggins, a junior printer who used to be the head of the Baker Street Irregulars, and you've got an interesting and rollicking story. And finally, on May 22nd, to celebrate the birthday of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, it's the second edition of The Monographs, Becoming Sherlock Holmes. The first set was comprehensive, but an introduction to the world of thinking like Sherlock Holmes. From looking at the practices of neuroscience, we can develop our own emotional control and sharpness of our minds, just like Sherlock Holmes. Ben Cardall takes us through all of that in this second edition. So browse around at mxpublishing.com, find what suits your reading needs, and envelop yourself in Sherlock Holmes stories today. Chris Chan is a writer and educator with a doctorate in American history and an MLIS in information science. He's a 2023 winner of the Temple Grandin Prize. He works as a researcher and international goodwill ambassador for Agatha Christie Limited. He's the creator of the Funderburk and Kaming mysteries, including Ghosting My Friend and She Ruined Our Lives, as well as the comedic mysteries Sherlock's Secretary and Nessie's Nemesis. And, of course, he pushed him in other Sherlock Holmes stories. His literary criticism works include Murder Most Grotesque, the comedic crime fiction of Joyce Porter, and Sherlock and Irene. Patricia Meyer Chan, Ph.D., is a licensed psychologist with over 25 years of counseling experience with children, adults, and families as they cope with issues such as anxiety, depression, PTSD, and developmental disabilities across the lifespan. Patricia and Christopher, welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to start where we start with all of our guests, and we'll ask each of you in turn, where and how did you first meet Sherlock Holmes?
Well, I have my mother to thank for that, because I was about, I think, 8 or 9 years old, and she first gave me my first Sherlock Holmes book, this beautiful illustrated edition of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. So with each story had this beautiful oil painting image in it. And I read a few more, and I think the next year I got this great big red-covered copy of the complete Sherlock Holmes with Christopher Morley's introduction and every story in teeny tiny print. So I must have read that at least 6 or 7 times, not always cover to cover, but in various orders over the following years. And I kept on going, and other than The Great Mouse Detective, the first adaptations I remember seeing were some of the Basil Rathbone, Nigel Bruce movies, and around 8th grade, I really got hooked on their radio series.
Oh, which series was that?
The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes with Rathbone and Bruce during World War II.
Yeah, that's iconic. They did hundreds of episodes there, so plenty of material to go on.
Yes. I mean, when I first started listening to them, this is when they started selling them on cassette tapes, a half-hour show on a side. So that shows how long it's been since I first got into it.
I used to have many of those myself, Chris, so you're not alone. Pat, how about you? How did you first meet Sherlock Holmes?
Well, I got a much later start than Chris. I must have been 14 when I discovered Sherlock, and, I've always been a fan since then. And I guess, I taught English for a while, and so introduced my students. And then I have committed the crime of giving my children only educational toys and books. So that's where Chris got involved in all this.
I don't think that's much of a crime at all. Guilty as charged.
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. So have the two of you, before this book came about, and we're going to talk to you about the Autistic Sleuth in a bit, Have you shared this mutual love of Sherlock Holmes? Have you done other things together?
Well, it's again with me around. It's hard not to. I've introduced Mom to a whole lot of adaptations, a whole lot of what's been on TV lately. A number of times around here there've been plays based on Sherlock Holmes, and I've been one of the a speaker, a number of them, where I've been able to before the show talk about Sherlock Holmes and everything, get the family free tickets, and they can listen to a few things. I guess I get to show off how much I know.
Well, that's wonderful, especially when they can appreciate it. I think there's a lot of us who are the only Sherlockians in our family, and we share this interest, and our families kind of look at us with a raised eyebrow and a bit of a quizzical glance. So it's wonderful you have that shared language together.
Yeah. Well, we both enjoy good literature, and I know it's not just Sherlock Holmes, but everything from Agatha Christie and other mysteries is a good way to connect.
Yeah, it's a terrific way to connect. And what about that, Agatha Christie and other mysteries? Have your interests gone beyond detective fiction and mystery fiction to other things like science fiction, or is it just pretty much mystery fiction and whodunits?
Yeah, it's like basically I like pretty much every genre except for erotica and things like that. But it's kind of like I love Tolkien and Lewis the most of all the science fiction and then fantasy group. But I mean, it's one of the things that I talk about at one point and would turn to something else, is that I really the issue of literary diplomacy, the idea of how some of our famous detectives from Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple are essentially cultural ambassadors, because I work for Agatha Christie Limited as what they call a international goodwill ambassador. And that's I reach out to fans around the world, and it's amazing how people wonder, what will bring the different peoples of the world together. And you discover that people of all nations, all races, religions, ages, backgrounds, fandom can really bring people together, whether it's and talk about Sherlock Holmes. And it's just the idea that how there's something that unifies people about good stories and great characters. And as I say, whether it's movies, and I would love to write another book about literary diplomacy at one point, talking about how the mysteries, other popular franchises, everything from comics like Peanuts, Tintin, and the Duck comics of Disney are popular all over the world.
Gee, you've just touched on so many things that unite Sherlockians. Even the Duck comics of Disney and Karl Barth's, that was an inspiration for one of the great cartoonists who has drawn a lot of Sherlock Holmes comics over the years. But the interesting thing, the thread here, is the worlds, because you're talking about Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Agatha Christie and Sherlock Holmes, and each one of these literary operations have a whole working universe that's interesting, and you can explore it. And then when you get to people around the world, this idea of literary diplomacy, it's these things, these stories that are translated or become somebody's first English reading that are so interesting because they show you a culture and a time, and you get caught up in the puzzle. The whole idea of literary diplomacy is really interesting.
Right. I was just talking about this with a friend the other day, the idea of how different countries have done various things to try to get use unusual forms of diplomacy to unite people. And I recently learned about the Thailand government using what they call culinary diplomacy. That's why when they have Thai people immigrate to the United States, many of them want to open up a Thai restaurant. And the Thai government has a training program to make sure that all these immigrants produce a high standard quality of food. that's why they want to make sure that there are no bad Thai restaurants. And when people get delicious Thai food, they think well of the country. And that's just one way of using, well, not exactly, well, culture. And also we talk about art as well, and just a way of thinking, you know what, it's, at first, I was brought up to, be skeptical or think negatively of this group of people, and all of a sudden, well, I love this fictional character, I love all this, and all of a sudden, like, you know what, I really start liking these people, and that's, it's the idea of bringing down prejudice and by getting to know culture.
And I think great literature or great art speaks to universals. We all have certain experiences and feelings. And when the authors are able to capture that and communicate it in a, good way, I think that's what grabs people.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. But, it's interesting. Your first entry into the world of Sherlock Holmes was through Rathbone and Bruce, and you took that into radio. And now we have the Autistic Sleuth, which is really dives deeply into adaptations and appearances of these characters. And before we talk about that, the one question I really wanted to ask you is, have you ever seen an adaptation, and I've got a couple of these in mind, where you've said to yourself, well, wait a second, this is not the character that I've come to love. This is sort of a lampoon, or it's a comedy, or have you ever been troubled by an adaptation?
Well, I mean, the first one that, of course, comes to mind is the Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly Holmes and Watson, which I wrote a review of it for The Strand. I write book and DVD reviews for the current version of The Strand, and it's sort of like, I remember opening that review with, "We live in troubled times. There's a lot of division and disagreement and anger amongst the community. But at this point, there is one thing bringing people together where everybody agrees. Holmes and Watson is terrible."
You're not the first one I've heard that from. There is a very, very small group of cult fans out there, but they are few and far between. So,
well,
and go ahead.
Yeah, it's like I've probably seen a lot more of Holmes adaptations than others, and I mean, for the most part, I consider myself a purist, although when it comes, because I like things that I like seeing all these great actors doing different takes on the work, but what I don't always care for is when it seems to go off track, and I think, like, I had an issue sometimes too, because while I like Henry Cavill, I thought that I don't care when the Enola Holmes sort of makes him second rate to his younger sister, but I've been actually very interested in seeing some of these Japanese adaptations, and because I do find it very interesting seeing how different cultures interpret them in different these characters in different ways, and as I say, the idea of finding something universal, even as they're shaped to their own familiar culture.
Well, I think that's a wonderful observation about finding something universal. And some of them, I was thinking too about Margaret Rutherford as Miss Marple and Tony Randall as Hercule Poirot. Back in the 60s, I guess those films were made. And it was sort of a different time, but still in all, there's something charming about, if you like the actors and you like the performances and you might enjoy that level of comedy, there's something charming about that. And I think that's not present in the other film you mentioned.
Yes. I think, well, first of all, Mom may have to bow out, but I just want to make sure she said goodbye.
So I leave you in good hands.
Okay. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you. And I just wanted to go on just a little bit more, I think, on that point when we're talking about the idea, because with Margaret Rutherford, she those movies, offend my sensibilities as a purist. But when it comes to Margaret Rutherford, it's like if today's stars had just 1/10 of her likability, we'd have a much more people. We wouldn't have the problems at the box office we are these days. And I think that's one of the things that I like about things with Sherlock Holmes is that when people are involved in them, you see that a lot of them are having fun and that they enjoy the source material. It's just the idea of it's so many people are trying to cry their way to an Oscar, and when you get to something like Sherlock Holmes, sometimes you get the idea that there's people are having a good time, and it's just that the audience is infectious to the audience.
Yeah, I think that makes a huge difference in the reception there. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Autistic Sleuth. The subtitle is Screen Portrayals of Detectives on the Spectrum in Sherlock Holmes Adaptations. Where did the idea for this concept come from?
Well, I think I had come across just some mentions of what's called like the mildly autistic super sleuth. It's become like a trope in a whole lot of on the internet when they review shows, and throughout the aughts and the really up through the teens as well, I started thinking about seeing this here and there. As you see that the fleeting reference on the Benedict Cumberbatch's Sherlock, where there's a quick mention where Watson says that he believes that Holmes has Asperger's in the Hounds of Baskerville, and like one quick mention, that's it. And then the show Community, where the character of Abed, played by Danny Pudi, talking about the idea of all these adaptations using the idea of an autism or difference as a trope, just to show a different kind of mind, and suggesting how it might be lazy and exploitative. And then again, all these other mentions too. I hear on some other shows talking on forums, talking about, this character demonstrates all these signs of autism. And after being diagnosed myself with autism back in 2009, I just thought, this is very interesting. And I started drawing up a list about 4 or 5 years ago of all these shows where people on the internet or in my own observation were thought to have autism, but aside from like one quick fleeting reference in one episode suggesting it, they never went into it. Nobody got an official diagnosis, and it never became a part of their official self-description. So I wondered about that, and I thought, a lot of my favorite shows have a character who is very clearly drawn to be somewhere on the autism spectrum. So over the last few years, I started drawing up a list, and suddenly 12 shows, then 15, 20. And last couple of years, I was finally seeing shows, interestingly not American shows, but from South Korea and France, where they finally officially diagnosed their detective. And I just thought, well, I've got to write a book about this. And my mom, who is a psychologist and expert in this, I got some help with that as discussing these things, and I started starting to write it, but it was very difficult because it was kind of personal for me. But just as in past fall and winter, I really just buckled down trying to finish the book, and now here we are.
Well, it's fascinating, and you describe it very well. Particularly when you describe it as sort of a trope that's not referenced, and you point out the difference between other cultures that might actually provide a diagnosis. I think one of the things that goes on if you're creating and writing a continuing character, you as the writer or the showrunner really have got sort of a binary choice. You can create a backstory for the character, which does require a little work and helps the actor, but it doesn't manifest itself well on the screen. Or you can create a series of verbal and attitudinal tics that make the character distinctive, like Monk, for example, like Tony Shalhoub in Monk. And I don't want to say it's a cop-out, but it tends to read well on the screen. I think that's one of the things that goes on. And then once you establish the character, you don't really have to revisit it, at least I think in most American-focused media.
Right. And I think you wonder, I mean, how much is a trope? And you think about, is the detective defined by his or her autism, or is it just the thing that puts that person as distinctive? Because you see so many shows where basically, like the tough, aggressive cop with an alcoholism problem. I think, not saying there are plenty of examples where, I mean, that's done brilliantly when everything from Dennis Franz and NYPD Blue or something like that. But once again, just the idea of sometimes, well, not to insult people, but let's just say Hollywood does not have a reputation for being original and innovative. And I think sometimes it's sort of like, and that's an issue I bring up, just the idea when a lot of people don't always see what happens, how autistic people think or respond. So what they may learn through TV shows. And when they see certain qualities, they assume, oh, well, this character on this show I like thinks a certain way, so therefore all autistic people must believe think the same way and respond the same way. It's more being quirky than anything else. And when in the book I try to explain how it's a lot more than that, how sometimes shows just use a surface level, or they may not even know they're doing it, but it's a case where people use certain characteristics and they may apply them well beyond their scope. And I think when I was reading Temple Grandin's book, The Autistic Brain, she talks about how she was stunned when she first started writing books about autism, and she had people, and she was telling people that she thought entirely in pictures. Thinking in Pictures is the name of one of her books. And the idea of I think that the idea of when she would assume that all autistic people must think in pictures. And then in the Amazon comments, she started getting all these responses saying, that I have autism and that's not how I think. And she was surprised by this and started doing more research. And that's how she learned that there's so many different ways, how some people are more verbal and some think in video or images, but they all have uniting characteristics, but it's much more complex than that. And I think that that's something that I think is important, because when I wrote, one of the problems is most of the literature on autism is for specialists. It's highly technical. You have to, have a background in terminology, and it's very dry. And quite frankly, the average reader can't get through more than a few pages of it. And so with a book like The Autistic Sleuth, we're talking about a lot of people's favorite mystery shows. And it's a lot easier to connect with a character you're familiar with who entertains you than is talking about all this dry research testing that just most people get turned off by. So I'm hoping that this is by focusing on fictional characters, there's a new approach to different understanding, get people talking, because it's a lot easier to use a TV show character or a movie character as a point of comparison, what works, what doesn't, than it is just talking about a list of characteristics of check boxes on a form.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a really important point, because the more we've learned about autism, it's not just a single diagnosis, as you state in the title. It's a spectrum of different characteristics, and it's under the broader term now of what's being used more and more of neurodiversity. And neurodiversity is just that. We are all different in some way. And what you're analyzing here, all of these different character traits, all of these different elements along the spectrum, they show up differently in these detectives. And I'm particularly interested, Chris, in understanding more about your own personal journey, because you said you weren't diagnosed until 2009. That was a little later on in your life. It wasn't as a child, was it?
No, I was in my late 20s then. And I think I actually talk about this quite a bit in one of the early chapters of the book, based on a lecture I gave at the Chesterton conference a couple of years ago. But it's a case where, it's sort of like I always knew that my brain worked differently from other people, but I didn't understand why I had so much more trouble with social situations than other people. And when it's sometimes, how I process information, and whether it was noticing little sounds or sights that most people didn't, or extremely vivid memory, or just bad reactions to being touched. And I think growing up, especially during puberty, and I had these terrible, terrible meltdowns, I thought, am I going crazy? Do I have some sort of serious mental disorder? Because no one else I know gets freaked out by certain smells or sounds. Why am I responding like this? And people just didn't know or talk about then. And when I met in one later in the book, I think there's this one scene in a Law and Order Criminal Intent where I talk about the autistic perpetrator, where this one character who's in his 40s or so has undiagnosed autism, and it's when he's finally shown what autism is and how to define it, he just goes, "This is me. That why didn't anybody tell me about this?" And he's told by Detective Ames that that people just didn't really know about till a few years ago. But it's a case where it wasn't until my mother started seeing people who have autism and had been identified at early age, and she started thinking, I think my son may have this. And I just thought, it would have made things so much easier, at least to have known just why I thought and responded as I did, just if I'd known about 20, 25 years earlier. And sort of now I'm trying to learn from it, trying to function better, but it's sort of like, I think it's going to be a big generational thing, how you have all these people who always knew there was something different, but didn't know why, and were just told they were weird or something derogatory for years, or been misdiagnosed with a certain form of mental disorder, against people who have been caught at a young age and have received counseling and training since they were kids.
Well, I think you're absolutely spot on about that. There's going to be a lot of awareness moving into the future, and thinking about your own lens that you put on this as you took this to the field of detectives and their portrayal. What were some surprises, perhaps, that you came across with this lens on the detective genre?
Well, as I looked through it, as I thought, I was actually, surprised by how few shows were willing to talk about it. Just the idea, and I mentioned how on shows like Sherlock, and also on shows like Doc Martin, where you have a medical detective, how there's in all of their series runs, you have one episode where autism and Asperger's gets a 1-second throwaway line, or a scene where a potential diagnosis, and then it's never brought up again. And it's on all these. I've read about this because they talked about how on The Big Bang Theory, they didn't want to give a word for what exactly Sheldon had. The idea of they want all these screenwriters, they wanted some flexibility. Or in another case on the show Bones, how the character of Bones was shaped around someone really smart they knew, but they didn't want to deal with an official diagnosis. And you see all these scenes where all these characters are meeting with actual mental health professionals. And you'd think that wouldn't one of them even suggest it? But and that's why I call one chapter in the book autism, the condition that must not be named, because it's sort of like they go out of their way to avoid diagnoses. It's sort of like sometimes you see all these characters maybe struggling or having trouble, but it's like they refuse to give the character a lifeline in a way of understanding how something works, how their own brains work, and then making it easier for them to connect, getting training that might help make things socially or in relationships easier or better, or at least help them even professionally when people marginalize them as being weird or just some kind of strange or even potentially dangerous, which is unjustified because they just don't understand. And I think that was an issue in a whole lot of these shows. And I think what also surprised me was the negative reaction of some watchers or fans, because people said that this is how Hollywood portrays autism, but this is not me. And there's a lot of resentment with some people with autism who feel like they think because of these shows, the average layperson assumes that all autistic people are super smart and quirky and and likable, and it's like, and they're saying that, and I personally have a lot of trouble, and this doesn't fit me at all. It's not how I think. It's not how I respond, and people just are upset about it. And I want to make it clear that just because I think there are different forms of autism, it manifests in different ways. And one of the things that connects me to this subject is I think that many of these shows very closely mirror my own thought processes, reactions, and personal experience. So I connect with it. I can see myself in it a lot, but I can't stress this enough. Not all people with autism will be able to connect the same way, because as we say, it's a spectrum, and I don't want people to think they're lesser or worse or more unusual or anything negative, nothing pejorative, because they don't have their autism reflects very differently from on these shows. It's a case where I want to make sure that when, as we said before, with Dr. Temple Grandin learning that not everybody thinks the same way she does, that not all autistic people are the same, reflect the same way as on these autistic sleuths we talk about. I know that I see myself, but there are so many people that don't, and I'm trying to wonder if there are better ways of explaining this, just to show how other people have different reactions and are just, as I said, we have to note that it's not universal.
You know, you've done such really important work, and it's such a contribution, I think, the Autistic Sleuth to the discussion of this. And in fact, in the book, you cover what looks to be 40 or 50 different television series. But I'm curious, have you come across any representation that you thought that you thought got it, that you thought did a better job than all the ones that didn't?
Well, I'm very, looking at all these shows, I think there's a number of them, if you don't mind me going through some of what I think are some of the best.
Oh, please do.
Well, one of the most recent, and one of the only two shows where the character is actually diagnosed with autism, is a South Korean show called Extraordinary Attorney Woo. Are either of you familiar with that?
Can't say I am.
Well,
No.
it's a South Korean show where there's a young woman with autism, and she's a brilliant lawyer, but she has trouble getting a job because, with her autism, she behaves differently, and people are afraid to hire her. And the show shows how she gradually earns the respect of those around her and becomes a better lawyer, and also provides a look inside her mind. In fact, actually, the second episode is clearly inspired by the Sherlock Holmes story, The Noble Bachelor, too. But that's another Sherlock Holmes connection. But you can watch it on Netflix, both dubbed or with subtitles. But I think I really like the show, and I think that it's a good way of showing how one character with autism and doesn't shy away from the issue. All the meltdowns, how she deals with textures and so forth. So that's one issue. I think that's one show I highly recommend. And I think when we're talking about how people think, because we talk about how Thinking in Pictures by Dr. Temple Grandin, and I think in a mixture of ways, with both verbally and with pictures and video, but also smells and tastes and textures at one point. But I often think through things a certain way or process things with visually and with words. And when I first saw the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock, where when he observes things and he actually, when he notes things, he puts little words and text up as he notes them, and he processes information. I thought, oh my goodness, this is me, because I'd never seen anybody go beyond realism to describe the way I think before. And I was just thought that, have they put a camera inside my brain? Because this is how I think. And similarly with the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes, one of the tropes in those movie films is that how before he's about to do something, he sort of thinks it through step by step and predicts how everything's going to work out. And I thought, I do this. It's like whether it's just going up to the counter at a supermarket to buy your food, or whether it's trying to give a presentation or a lecture or start a conversation with someone, just the idea of the step-by-step predictions of how you're going to do it, running it through before you actually do. And I thought when they devised that, I thought that is me as well. And when I read the book, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, the character of Christopher Boone, once again, I thought someone was spying on my life, because just the way Christopher Boone thinks and talks and reacts. I think, other than his approach to religion, I thought that, oh my goodness, Christopher Boone is me. And that was exactly how I felt a lot of the time when I was a teenager. And once again, this is for me. I mean, there's so many other people who would respond differently and think this is nothing like my experience as an autistic person. This is just, but I don't want people to think, oh, this is just Hollywood doing its thing. And well, one way or another, they've managed to totally replicate how things are for people like me. Not everybody, but for the shows I've mentioned are just some of the ones that really nailed it for me, as you say.
Well, that's marvelous that you're able to pull out some of those common threads and feel that connection there. I think it's very clear that somebody at the writing table in these instances is paying attention or has had some experience. And I think what you and Pat are doing here to create more awareness will indeed create more unity across the community. It'll give people an opportunity to say, hey, that's a little like me, or hey, I noticed that too, and help more discussion around the topic of neurodiversity, which I'm sure we're going to be hearing a lot more about in the future.
Can I just add one more point on that real quick, please?
Sure.
Because I think my hope for this is that, and I had the problem myself, that it's so hard to describe what's in your mind, especially when there's so much going on at once. And I thought that what I would like too, whether it's parents with their children or just people of any age, the idea of being able to sit down, be able to show an episode of a TV series or a bit of a movie or something like that, and say, yeah, this is how I can describe how I'm feeling, or this is how, because I think it's so hard to find a metaphor and I was surprised when someone else used the same, on an internet site, used the same metaphor I did on the television show Chuck, a spy series, where at one point to describe this intersect, how all this information is put into a brain where there's a room that's completely lined with different TV screens and all this other things that flash through your mind. And that's a lot of times it's used like a metaphor for and some people just to explain how they think. And I just thought it's wonderful just to have an example saying, I can't describe what I'm thinking with words, but I can show you by showing you this TV show.
Yeah, and having that common point of connection, that common language to be able to communicate about it or share it together, so important. Well, the book is The Autistic Sleuth by Chris Chan and Patricia Meyer Chan. There are 10 days left on the Kickstarter. It actually expires on May 10th, but it's also going to be available from our sponsors, MX Publishing. So that's good news. If you don't make it in for the Kickstarter in time, there's still going to be an opportunity to pick this up from MX Publishing. Chris, thank you, and thanks to your mom as well, who I know had to leave us earlier in the show, for being with us here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Well, thank you both so much. I love the show podcast, and I really appreciate your having me. Thank you so much.
It's fascinating. The whole conversation is fascinating, but what a wonderful step forward, and how interesting to hear Chris talk about this as an alternative to the analytical, technical texts, and to get his perspective on increasing understanding about autism. And I love the way that you brought in neurodiversity as a topic. And also how interesting to hear about the extraordinary attorney Wu. I'll have to find that on Netflix. I just love conversations like that. I just come away with 4 or 5 new things to dig into.
Yeah, and talk about hearing of Sherlock everywhere. I mean, this is not something that the average street fan would be strolling down the street and saying, I wonder about Sherlock Holmes and autism, or and certainly, I think it's obvious in some of the shows that he mentioned, whether it's House or Monk or some of the more popular shows, people have drawn their conclusions, but the fact that it hasn't really been directly addressed in so many of them, I think it's probably healthier that it's mentioned, that it's drawn out and specifically mentioned, because it leaves fewer questions that way, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah. Well, it is healthy, but, it is, as we talked about that a little bit, when you talk about backstories and character definition, unfortunately, there's only so much time when you're producing a screenplay or you're writing something like this. And then you have to ask yourself, if I do 10 seconds on... See, the issue here is that, unfortunately, that having a character with these sorts of characteristics is fortunate for the writer and the showrunner and the director, because it's an almost limitless source of challenges. That's why there's usually an issue about a romantic entanglement, because the audience is rooting for the character, and they would like to see the character overcome the social challenges, if those exist in the character. And so that's what you tend to focus on, rather than, let's talk a little bit about exactly what this is all about and how it works and what the issues are.
Yeah, and, at the same time, I would imagine, and I can't speak for Chris, but I would imagine anytime someone is diagnosed with something, suddenly the clarity arises, and all of the pieces begin to fit together. And in that case, if the diagnosis were there, if it were talked about in the show, perhaps that would go a long way in solving some of that conflict or that angst. Then again, maybe that's exactly what the showrunners want. They want that degree of suspense, that will this person be able to figure this stuff out, the relationship, the interaction, etc., or will they keep going on, in a troubled way?
Yeah. Well, you're dead right about that. And think of the benefit. If you want to make an argument for, should we devote 5 minutes or 10 minutes to this? I think the answer is sure, absolutely. It should be part of the story. It's not going to cost you as the screenwriter as the folks involved in the production, anything, and it's going to be another great boon to the actor. So.
Well, speaking of not costing you anything, it's everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz program. That's right, it's Canonical Couplet, where we give you 2 lines of poetry, and you get to respond for free with your choice of Sherlock Holmes stories that you think we have chosen our particular couplet from. And of course, as always, we give all the correct winners an opportunity to win when we put your name into a drum and bring out the big spinning prize wheel and give you a chance to win. So, the last time we were around here, here's the clue we gave you. Here, Greek meets Greek, one might append, and how. And here Big Brother Mycroft takes his bow. Bert. I mean, this is almost too good to be true, too easy to be true, but I'm going to leave it to you just the same.
Well, I don't remember. My memory is so faulty. I don't remember the actual wording of the case, but I'm pretty sure it's the story where Mycroft brings home a client who helps Victorian inventors explain their work. That's what this is, right? It was the case Watson called The Adventure of the Geek Interpreter.
So close.
So close.
So close. No, you're one letter off. Can you believe it?
Is it tau or phi?
Well,
gamma?
It's all Greek to me, is what it is. Well, I'm going to turn to our friend Eric Deckers, who says, he was upset about the last Canonical Couplet. He objected to the veiled lodger, but he said you need to fire the writer last week because he or she was terribly misleading. I'm hoping to redeem myself, Eric says, through this week's answer, because it's the story of the Arabian prince who owned an electric light-up reptile commonly found in Florida. It's the story of the Sheik's Ampere Gator. Wow, that's a stretch even for me. It's more likely the Greek interpreter.
The Sheik's Ampere Gator. I like that.
Unless the writer is messing with us again and it's actually the Adventure of the Lion's Mane. Well, no, you got that right, Eric. It was the Greek interpreter. That's the good news. Well, lots of correct answers this week, as you would imagine, because it was a pretty easy one. So I'm going to try and haul in the spinning prize wheel here. Extra large one. So,
nice that you oiled the axles.
I know.
don't hear the squeaking anymore.
Nice. Dragging it across the floor here. Okay. Now it's in place. There we go. All right. And now let's give the prize wheel a big spin. All right. It is going around and slowing down on number 42. 42. And that looks like it is Christopher Yule. Christopher, congratulations to you. We will have, let's see, what did we have last time for our prize? It was, I know, it was a copy of Elizabeth Crowan's Hound of the Hollywood Baskervilles. So we will have that out to you without too much delay. Well, now it's time for the next Canonical Couplet. Here we go. More than the yard, plus Pinkertons could handle, was solved by Sherlock with a lighted candle. If you know the answer to this canonical couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment at ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If you are among all of the correct answers and we choose your name at random, you'll win. Good luck. All right, Bert, we will wait to see how you do with that one. Should be interesting. Have you got a feel for it at this point, or
I have to think. It's how my mind works. It's not images or pictures or concepts or ideas. It's there's a certain randomness to my insights.
Curious indeed.
Yeah, I get a lot of great suggestions from my sock drawer. I find if I have an opportunity to commune with my collection of socks early in the morning, occasionally wonderful things occur to me, like, why don't you put on a pair of shoes, buddy?
Well, you must have quite a few. Well, like the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime, I guess this is the curious incident of Bert's brain on Canonical Couplets. In which case you say, but Bert's brain did nothing in the Canonical Couplets.
That's right.
That was the curious incident. Yes. Good. Well,
I'm just waiting for next year. I mean, when are we going to tell people that in 2025 we're going to be introducing the canonical triplets? When? And by the way, how are the canonical triplets? I haven't talked to them.
We need a paternity test first.
Well, no, they all look alike. What do you mean a paternity test?
But who do they look like? They're not mine.
Well, they all have, that uniting physical characteristic and facial feature that's so dramatic and also becoming, as I like to think of it.
Okay, well, maybe we can match them up with a portrait in Baskerville Hall. Figure it out.
Oh, what a good idea.
Yeah. Well, speaking of good ideas, I think it's time to end the show. This is everyone's favorite part of the show.
Superb idea.
Oh, well, this is the very singular Scott Monty.
And I am the multiple personalities of Bert Wolder. No, you're not. Yes, I am.
And together, we all say...
The games. Afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.